And we're back again for the second part of our conversation with CZ's chairman, Marek Matraszek, at his home. Hi, Marek.
Welcome back. It seems just like yesterday that we
Just
were
like
chatting.
yesterday. And we finished previously on the upcoming rivalry between Trzaskowski and Duda in the presidential election, but we haven't discussed the other candidates. I'm especially curious about the independent Szymon Hołownia, who before the resignation of Kidawa-Błońska scored 20% in one of the polls. Is he still set to be a major force?
Well, yeah, that was one poll, although that was the best poll for him. But even the other ones were showing him sort of actually moving ahead of not just Kidawa-Błońska, but also Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, as you rightly say. A lot of people say that was ultimately down to two factors. One was Kidawa-Błońska's own decision to boycott the elections, or announcement that she was going to boycott the elections. And so that disproportion was much clearer in Hołownia's favour. But also the other thing, Hołownia is actually making a great inroads in terms of campaigning through social media. He's got a huge Facebook following. He actually is focusing his campaign on social media, and that worked very well during the lockdown, and when the other candidates were not campaigning, and some candidates like Mrs. Kidawa-Błońska were actually calling for a physical boycott of the elections and not really campaigning at all. So that elevated and promoted his campaign. The real test for him will be whether that vote that he secured, how much is that really associated with him, or will it start to drift back? And certainly that is Rafał Trzaskowski's goal, is to try and claw back a lot of that Hołownia vote. But as I say, I think in elections, not just in Poland, we've seen that's really a shift of electoral dynamics. And it may be that this Hołownia social media campaign has actually driven a lot of voters to him, which are quite sticky. And it may be difficult to claw back, but we'll have to wait and see what the polls show in the next couple of weeks.
The ruling Law and Justice didn't see him, in my opinion, as a threat, because their political attacks didn't focus on Szymon Hołownia. They focused on Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, the leader of the Polish People's Party, the PSL. Before Kidawa-Błońska resigned, it is Kosiniak-Kamysz who became the leading opposition candidate, and commentators said that he is the most presidential out of them all. Do you see any potential for him now that Trzaskowski is in the game?
Well, I think Trzaskowski's entry has actually changed the dynamics on the opposition side. All three candidates at that earlier, Kidawa-Błońska, Kosiniak-Kamysz and Hołownia, were perceived and were actually presenting themselves as sort of fairly centrist, moderate, rational candidates. So there was a competition for that centre vote between them. With Trzaskowski's entry into the game, who's a much more polarising candidate, as we were discussing in our last conversation, I think that will actually push Kosiniak-Kamysz back into the background. And I think that's one of the key things that will happen in this campaign, is that polarising effect will decrease the attractiveness of some of these more centrist candidates who really find themselves squeezed between these two very conflicted and polarising personalities of President Duda and Rafał Trzaskowski. The big question, as I said earlier, is to what extent Hołownia's vote is actually subject to the same squeeze. The latest polls are showing that now Hołownia and Trzaskowski are sort of are jockeying for that position to be in the second round with Duda. We will see over the next few days.
And still the most likely scenario is that Duda will get re-elected. So I wanted to ask you what happens afterwards, because the crisis that the ruling party went through, or maybe is going through, the ruling camp, the United Right, so the crisis between former deputy Prime Minister Gowin and Law and Justice leader Jarosław Kaczyński, has subsided for now. We have discussed this previously, but after Duda wins and the dust settles post-election, will there be a reshuffle? Is there a chance that the Morawiecki government will fall, or the coalition itself reformulate itself?
Well, you actually said something very interesting at the beginning, was that the certainty that Duda will win. And I still think that's the likelier scenario. because I think what will happen is that you will see some of the voters that were in the first round voting for Kosiniak-Kamysz, the agricultural, rural, peasant vote to a large extent, and also the more nationalist vote around Mr. Bosak, who's the leader of the Confederation Party, will gravitate more towards Duda. So I think he will gain the plurality in the second round, but the latest opinion poll today shows it at a 53-47 break in favour of Duda. So it's not much to do for Trzaskowski to make up, but I still think it'll be an uphill struggle. But to go back to your fundamental question about the dynamics within the Law and Justice Party, it's very interesting because, as you know, this entire confusion over the election date was generated by former Deputy Prime Minister Gowin, who's the leader of the more liberal conservative faction of the Law and Justice United Right Alliance, the Agreement Party. And although he's come back into the fold, as it were, it's clear that the entire experience of this election has changed the dynamics within the ruling, people say Law and Justice, but it's actually, as you know, it is an alliance of Law and Justice proper. Mr. Gowin's Agreement Party and Mr. Ziobro's Solidarity Poland Party. And these two factions of the United Right coalition, I think, have now sensed that this is an opportunity for them to sort of re-establish their credentials as really key partners for Jarosław Kaczynski and governance. And that sets up a new dynamic within the ruling coalition. I don't think there's any appetite in either the camp of Mr. Ziobro or even the camp of Mr. Gowin to foment a future crisis which would lead to the collapse of the Morawiecki government. But I think and I think the intention is very much to keep the United Right together in Parliament, where they have a 5-seat majority through to the next parliamentary election in 2023. But what happens then, I think, is very interesting. So you will see a much more dynamic situation within the governing alliance. Ultimately, I think Mr. Morawiecki is safe as Prime Minister until the elections. But what happens over the next 3 years, I mean, that's a very long time in Polish politics. It's 3.5 years until the next parliamentary elections. People mustn't forget that, and a lot can happen. But key to that will be whether Duda wins. If he does win, I think that will cement the coalition for the remainder of the parliamentary term. But politics being politics, you never know what's going to happen.
Thanks. That's why we're here, and that's why we're going to come back ahead of the election.
Thank you very much, Staszek. See you back here very soon again, I hope.
Thank you.